On one Friday in 1986, Kodak distributed $158 million in annual bonuses to 55,000 employees around Rochester. Retailers and car dealers had marked the date on their calendars because they knew where the money would go. 26 years later, Kodak entered bankruptcy, carrying roughly $6.7 billion in debt and legacy obligations, with barely 500 local workers left. Rochester had built a middle class around a company whose business could no longer support a city-sized payroll. At High Falls, the Genesee River drops through the center of Rochester with enough force to throw mist above the gorge. Before the brick warehouses, railroad bridges, and camera factories crowded its banks, channels cut into the rock diverted part of that water into mill races. The river entered through gates, passed beneath stone buildings, turned wheels and shafts, and returned to the gorge carrying flour dust and bits of grain. The machinery came later. The water was already there. This was Onondaga, or Seneca, land. The river valley had supported Seneca towns, fields, hunting grounds, and travel routes long before Rochester existed as a word. In 1788, the land on which the city would rise was ceded under the Phelps and Gorham Purchase, a transaction the University of Rochester now describes as unjust and still unredressed. Surveyors followed. Property lines crossed ground that had never required them. In Canal 803, Nathaniel Rochester, Charles Carroll, and William Fitzhugh purchased a 100-acre tract beside the Upper Falls. The location offered little protection from winter and no direct water route to the Atlantic. What it possessed was a useful collision of geography. South of the falls lay the Genesee Valley, where farmers planted wheat in deep soil. North of them, the river ran toward Lake Ontario. Between the fields and the lake, the water descended through a succession of falls inside what would become the city. A sack of wheat could arrive by wagon. Gravity could grind it. Early mill owners sold water rights almost as carefully as they sold land. Along Brown's Race, laborers excavated a channel near the edge of the gorge. Water left the river above the falls and moved beside the growing settlement, where millers could direct it through their machinery. Inside the mills, water wheels turned horizontal shafts. Gears transferred the motion upward. Belts and pulleys carried it across several floors to elevators, sifters, and pairs of grinding stones. The river did not merely stand beside the factories, it passed through them. But Rochester's water had one serious defect. It flowed north when the richest American markets lay east. Flour could be ground cheaply beside the Genesee and still remain expensive to move. Barrels traveled by wagon over roads that became mud in rain and ruts in winter. Water power without transportation was a machine without a loading door. The Erie Canal supplied the missing piece. Its stone aqueduct carried canal boats across the Genesee by 1823, 2 years before the full canal opened between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. The crossing placed a man-made east and west river directly over the natural north-flowing one. Rochester's mills could draw wheat from an expanding agricultural interior, seal the flour inside barrels, and send those barrels toward Albany and New York City without loading them onto a wagon for the entire journey. The arrangement was so productive that the village acquired a nickname before it had acquired old buildings. It became the Flour City. By the end of 1835, Rochester contained 21 flour mills operating 96 pairs of grinding stones. When all of them ran, they could consume 20,000 bushels of wheat in a day. That was not grain stored quietly in a ledger. It arrived in wagons and canal boats, passed through chutes and elevators, disappeared between stones, and emerged as many as 5,000 barrels of flour before the next morning. Those barrels required another city of work around them. Coopers bent staves and hammered iron hoops. Teamsters moved wheat from dock to mill and flour from mill to warehouse. Machine shops repaired gears, shafts, and water wheels. Merchants extended credit before the grain arrived and collected payment after the flour had traveled hundreds of miles beyond their view. Rochester was learning to coordinate farms, machines, labor, packaging, and distant customers around a product that had to remain nearly identical from one barrel to the next. Flour did not keep its throne. During the 1840s and 1850s, disease damaged wheat crops in the Genesee Valley. Cultivation moved westward onto newer land closer to the expanding grain centers of the Great Lakes. Rochester's canal had reduced the cost of distance, but distance had not disappeared. Cities nearer the new wheat fields could grind grain without first carrying it back toward the Genesee. The irony was built from stone and water. The transportation system that had enlarged Rochester's market also enlarged the territory from which competitors could enter it. The mills diminished, but the habits surrounding them remained. Capital moved into nurseries, seeds, clothing, shoes, tools, and metal goods. Workshops that had maintained mill machinery could make other mechanisms. Merchants already understood that a factory in Rochester did not need customers standing outside its door. Its goods could leave in barrels, boxes, canal boats, and railroad cars. Then precision joined volume. In 1853, a German immigrant named John Jacob Bosch opened a small optical shop in Rochester. With $60 borrowed from his friend Henry Lomb, the business expanded from imported spectacles into manufacturing. By 1875, Bosch and Lomb was producing microscopes. Workers shaped glass surfaces, fitted lenses into metal tubes, and assembled instruments in which a small error could make an image useless. In 1887, John's son Edward would patent an iris diaphragm and shutter positioned between a camera's lenses. Long before Kodak dominated photography, Rochester already contained people who knew how to grind grain by the trainload and glass by fractions of an inch. One industry had taught the city to control volume, power, packaging, and movement. Another was teaching it to control light. In 1878, a 24-year-old bookkeeper at the Rochester Savings Bank planned a trip to Santo Domingo. A co-worker suggested that he take photographs, so George Eastman bought a camera and the chemicals and equipment required to use it. The apparatus was bulky, the process was exacting, and the journey was eventually abandoned. The boxes remained. By the time George Eastman bought his first camera, Rochester already knew how to turn a difficult process into a trainload of identical goods. At night, after the ledgers at Rochester Savings Bank had been closed, George Eastman worked in his mother's kitchen. Gelatin and silver salts were heated near the stove. Glass plates lay beside bottles, trays, and measuring vessels. The room intended for cooking became a small chemical workshop, and some nights Eastman was so tired that, according to his mother, he slept on a blanket beside the stove without removing his clothes. The difficulty had followed him home from the photographic outfit he purchased in 1878. A camera of that period was a large wooden box mounted on a heavy tripod. The photographer carried glass plates, a plate holder, chemical tanks, trays, water, and sometimes a tent that served as a portable darkroom. Eastman later described the complete outfit as a pack-horse load. Taking the picture was only one movement within a longer sequence of mixing, coating, sensitizing, exposing, developing, washing, and fixing. Under the wet collodion process, a clean sheet of glass was coated with a solution containing cellulose nitrate, alcohol, and bromide salts. The plate was then sensitized with silver nitrate in darkness. While it remained wet, it had to be placed in the camera, exposed, removed, and developed. A photographer in a field was therefore also a traveling chemist, carrying a dark enclosure because sunlight could ruin the plate before the camera had a chance to use it. The shutter might open for only a moment. Everything surrounding that moment could occupy an afternoon. Eastman found a more forgiving method in British photographic journals. Instead of wet collodion, glass could be coated with an emulsion of gelatin and silver bromide. Once dried, the plate remained sensitive. It could be manufactured in advance, packed into a holder, exposed when needed, and developed later. The photographer no longer had to race against a drying chemical surface. This was an improvement, but Eastman saw another problem. A useful formula was not yet a factory process. When emulsion was spread across glass by hand with a rod, one plate might receive a thicker layer than the next. Uneven coating meant uneven sensitivity. A photographer could follow the same procedure twice and obtain two different results because the product beneath the image had not been made consistently. Eastman answered with machinery. His first United States patent, issued on April 13, 1880, described a device for coating photographic plates. A rubber roller sat partly submerged in a trough of warm emulsion. Above it, suction cups held a sheet of glass. When an operator turned a crank, the plate traveled across the roller, which spread an even layer over its underside. After drying, the coated glass could be cut into smaller plates. The kitchen experiment had become a repeatable mechanical motion. Trough, roller, glass, crank. Eastman licensed the patent and rented the third floor of a building on State Street. Among his early purchases was a used steam engine for $125. It produced 2 horsepower, twice what he believed he needed. But he bought the larger machine because the business might grow into it. Henry Alva Strong believed that it would. Strong manufactured buggy whips in Rochester, an industry with no obvious connection to silver bromide, except that it generated investment capital. His money joined the proceeds from Eastman's patent, and on January 1st, 1881, the two men formed the Eastman Dry Plate Company. At first, the company sold convenience to existing photographers. Its customers still understood lenses, exposures, negatives, and printing. Eastman merely relieved them of preparing each glass plate themselves. Yet glass remained heavy, fragile, and awkward to carry. Every photograph began as a rigid sheet that could crack in a case or cut the person handling it. Eastman began looking for a support that could bend. By 1885, his company was offering light-sensitive material wound on a roll of paper. A roll holder could fit into cameras designed for glass plates, allowing several exposures without replacing a separate sheet each time. The paper was lighter. It did not shatter. It could be manufactured and transported as a continuous strip. It also left its texture in the photograph. The fibers of the paper could appear in the finished print, as though the image had been pressed against a faint screen. Eastman tried to separate the picture from its support. He coated the paper first with soluble gelatin, then added a second, light-sensitive layer. After exposure and development, the image-bearing emulsion could be stripped from the paper, transferred to clear gelatin, and protected with collodion. The procedure worked. Professional photographers still preferred glass. That rejection redirected the company. Eastman had expected people who already used glass plates to adopt film. Instead, he concluded that the larger market consisted of people who had never considered themselves photographers at all. They would tolerate technical imperfections if they did not have to understand the technical process. In 1888, the company introduced a black rectangular box called the Kodak. It had a fixed focus lens, a shutter button, and enough material inside for 100 circular photographs. The camera and its loaded roll sold for $25. There were no loose glass plates to insert and no emulsion to mix. The owner aimed the box, released the shutter, advanced the film, and repeated the motion. After the 100th exposure, the owner did something unusual. The entire camera was packed and sent to Rochester. For $10, Eastman's workers opened it, removed the exposed roll, developed the images, made a print from each usable exposure, loaded the camera with fresh film, and mailed the camera and photographs back. The customer performed the visible act. Rochester performed the dark, wet, chemical sequence that made the act permanent. Nothing had truly been removed from photography. The trays, chemicals, washing, drying, stripping, printing, and careful handling still existed. They had simply been gathered behind factory walls and placed at the other end of the postal system. Each Kodak created a circuit. A finished camera traveled out of Rochester. An exposed camera traveled back. Prints and a reloaded camera went out again. Convenience at the customer's end produced repeated work at the company's end. The $25 box was still expensive, more than Eastman himself had once earned. In a week at the bank, it had simplified photography, but it had not yet put a camera into every household. Once the camera could come home by mail, Eastman no longer needed to sell photography only to photographers. In 1900, a customer could place $1 on a store counter and leave with a Brownie camera. The body was made largely from stiff board, reinforced with wood, and covered in imitation leather. It contained a simple lens, a shutter, and little else. Beside it, a replacement roll of film sold for 15 cents. The box was inexpensive because the valuable machinery was somewhere else. Kodak could not have reached that counter with paper film alone. Paper bent and rolled, but its fibers could appear in the finished photograph. A transparent substitute existed in celluloid, though the early material was too thick and brittle for a compact roll. Henry Reichenbach, a chemist hired by Eastman, worked on a mixture of nitrocellulose, camphor, methanol, and other solvents. The formula produced a celluloid base, thin enough to bend and strong enough to survive a camera. Workers spread the liquid across large glass-top tables. As the solvents evaporated, a clear sheet formed on the surface. A light-sensitive emulsion was coated over it. The two layers were then peeled from the glass, cut into strips, and wound onto spools. Glass had become a ribbon. The useful part of that ribbon was almost too small to see. Suspended in gelatin were crystals of silver halide. When the camera shutter opened, light struck some crystals and left others unchanged, creating a latent image that remained invisible on the film. In the developer, the exposed crystals darkened as metallic silver accumulated. The fixer dissolved the silver compounds that had not been exposed. What remained was a negative. Light surfaces rendered dark. Dark surfaces rendered clear. The Brownie owner did not need to know any of this. The camera was designed by Frank Brownell to be operated with a few movements. The user held the box steady, released the shutter, and advanced the roll. There was no ground glass screen on which to focus an image and no plate to prepare. Kodak advertised the camera, especially to children, a group not generally trusted with glass sheets, silver nitrate, or portable darkrooms. Within the next few years, millions of Brownies were sold. Millions of inexpensive boxes moved into bedrooms, schoolyards, railroad coaches, parlors, and picnic baskets. Each one was durable enough to keep but useless for its intended purpose, without another roll of coated material. That distinction became the foundation of Kodak's business. You press the button, we do the rest. Sounded like a promise of ease. It was also a precise description of how the work had been divided. The customer supplied the occasion, and the fraction of a second during which the shutter remained open. Kodak supplied the film base, silver compounds, gelatin, coating machinery, spools, paper, chemicals, laboratories, and processing knowledge. The button could be pressed anywhere. Most of the profitable complexity remained in Rochester. Kodak's advertising widened the number of occasions on which that button ought to be pressed. The Kodak girl appeared with a camera while traveling, beside automobiles and near beaches. She was young, mobile, and rarely burdened with photographic equipment beyond the small camera in her hand. Other advertisements placed cameras near Christmas trees and family gatherings. The company was not merely answering a demand for photographs. It was identifying subjects for customers: a child on a porch, relatives around a table, a birthday cake before the candles disappeared, a dog that would not sit still, a vacation whose scenery would otherwise return home only in conversation. These pictures entered albums. A professional portrait might be made once in several years, with the family dressed and arranged in a studio. A snapshot could be made whenever someone opened a present, boarded a train, or stood briefly in good sunlight. The less formal photography became, the more often it occurred. Every exposure shortened the distance to the next purchase. The brownie could be sold for $1 because Kodak did not have to earn its full return from the box. One camera might require roll after roll of film over many years. Each roll also created negatives that could be developed and printed on coated paper. The camera was a durable object attached to a stream of materials that were exposed, processed, and replaced. Kodak sold the cup cheaply. Rochester supplied what was poured into it. The resulting market power eventually became visible in federal court records. In 1915, a district court found that Kodak had monopolized the amateur camera, film, and photo finishing businesses through acquisitions and exclusionary practices. Under the consent decree issued in 1921, Kodak agreed to dispose of portions of companies it had acquired. The decree also restricted exclusive arrangements that prevented dealers from freely carrying competing products. The government had not objected to a cardboard camera. It had objected to how much of the shelf behind that camera had come under the same control. A second consent decree in 1954 exposed the same mechanism in color. Kodak had included the price of processing in the sale of its color film. At the time, roughly 9 of every 10 rolls of color film sold in the United States came from Kodak, and the arrangement carried nearly the same share of color processing to Kodak laboratories. The decree required the company to separate film sales from processing and make color finishing technology available to competitors. By then, the little box had led to a business that federal orders needed hundreds of pages to separate. The material demands were equally large. Transparent film required solvents: cotton-derived nitrocellulose, camphor, gelatin, silver compounds, clean water, controlled heat, and long coating surfaces protected from dust and stray light. Film had to be cut, perforated, spooled, wrapped, boxed, and carried to retailers in quantities that the rooms on State Street could no longer hold. In 1891, Kodak transferred film and photographic paper production to 4 new buildings at Kodak Park. That move was only a beginning. The recurring appetite created by inexpensive cameras would require railroad tracks, power plants, water lines, laboratories, warehouses, smokestacks, and enough factory ground to alter the northern edge of Rochester. Every cheap box leaving Rochester created a reason to buy another roll of film made there. On a map, Kodak Park expanded as a series of rectangles. In 1910, the plant occupied 54 acres. By 1920, factory blocks, rail sidings, and utility buildings covered 235. By 1930, the property had reached 408 acres. Each new map filled portions of paper that had been empty on the one before. The family photograph was small. The machinery behind it required land. In 1890, George Eastman hired Dara Delancey, a young graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to help plan and manage the new manufacturing site on Rochester's northern edge. Film production had outgrown the State Street rooms, where chemistry, coating, cutting, and packaging competed for floor space. Kodak needed a place designed for processes that would not remain small. The first buildings at Kodak Park began making film and photographic paper in 1891. More followed. Coating rooms required long, clean surfaces and carefully controlled air. Chemical buildings needed tanks, pipes, ventilation, and distance from other operations. Warehouses received gelatin, cotton-derived chemicals, silver compounds, paper stock, coal, lumber, and packing materials. Finished film had to leave in sealed boxes before heat, moisture, dust, or light could damage it. Railroad tracks entered the property. Steam and electric lines crossed between buildings. Water arrived through pipes, passed through production, and left through drains carrying substances that would become part of another Rochester story. Kodak Park was only one piece of the company's local geography. Near the tower on State Street, Camera Works assembled still cameras, motion picture cameras, projectors, shutters, and other equipment. Across the Genesee Gorge, Hawkeye Works produced lenses, filters, microfilm apparatus, and optical mechanical devices. Kodak Park supplied film, paper, and chemicals. A picture taken in one box could therefore depend on work performed across several districts of Rochester. The largest site increasingly resembled a municipality built for one purpose. Its internal railroad shifted raw materials and finished goods between buildings. Powerhouses supplied electricity and steam. 2 smokestacks, completed in 1906 and 1910, rose 366 feet, higher than the Kodak office tower downtown. The plant developed water systems, fire protection, cafeterias, medical services, laboratories, roads, and its own numbered buildings. There was no mayor inside Kodak Park. There were managers, engineers, chemists, guards, physicians, and foremen. Research belonged within this landscape. Kodak had maintained an experimental and testing laboratory at the park since 1890, examining materials such as gelatin, silver nitrate, and halide salts before they entered production. In 1912, Eastman hired the British photographic scientist Charles Edward Kenneth Mies to organize a formal research laboratory in Rochester. The laboratory was not an academic annex separated from the factory by a lawn. A change in silver halide crystals could alter exposure time. A new sensitizing dye could allow film to respond to colors it had previously failed to record. A stronger or safer film base could require different solvents, coating tables, drying rooms, and cutting machines. When research changed the emulsion, the factory had to change with it. Kodak turned scientific findings into additional pipes and floors. The company also constructed systems around the people who operated them. In 1912, employees received the first annual wage dividend. The payment varied with company results, but its arrival became familiar enough to enter household planning. A Kodak worker's compensation was no longer confined to the amount printed on the weekly pay envelope. The company's performance could appear later as a larger payment used for furniture, repairs, savings, or a first installment on something more permanent. In 1920, Kodak established the Eastman Savings and Loan Association. Its stated purpose was to help employees save and purchase homes. More than 3,500 workers enrolled during its first week. The association accepted deposits, offered advice, and financed construction and mortgages. Kodak did not build every employee's house. It helped determine which paychecks could become houses. This arrangement tied the company to Rochester in several directions at once. A worker might earn wages at Kodak Park, receive a wage dividend, deposit money in an institution created for Kodak employees, and use a loan from that institution to buy a house within reach of the factory. The house anchored a family to the city. The factory acquired a more settled labor force. The same mixture of private generosity and practical stability appeared elsewhere. George Eastman's money helped reshape the University of Rochester, establish the Eastman School of Music, build the Eastman Theater, and support a medical school, hospital, and dental dispensary. In 1915, after financing an outside survey of Rochester's relief system, he helped establish the Rochester Bureau of Municipal Research to examine city departments and public administration. These projects did not manufacture film. They produced trained doctors, scientists, musicians, administrators, and a city in which skilled employees might remain. Charity and industrial need occupied the same streets without becoming the same thing. The limits of the private system became visible during the Great Depression. Kodak executive Marion Folsom helped organize the Rochester Plan, under which participating companies created reserves to provide temporary payments to workers they laid off. 14 firms initially joined, covering 26,000 workers, roughly one-third of Rochester's industrial labor force. Kodak alone accounted for about half of those covered employees. When layoffs came, former workers registered at the Public Employment Office and checked back with their employers. Kodak paid approximately $21,000 in unemployment benefits during 1933, followed by $5,000 in 1934. The checks were real. So was the uncovered city around them. By 1933, only 8 participating firms remained, and more than 2/3 of Rochester's industrial workers stood outside the plan. The factory could imitate part of a safety net. It could not stretch one across an economic collapse. Even during that collapse, Kodak's place in Rochester remained difficult to separate from the city itself. By 1934, the company employed approximately 23,000 Rochester residents. It was an employer, landholder, chemical producer, research institution, lender, cultural patron, and a presence in debates over how the city should be administered. Kodak Park had begun as a location for making film. It had become the physical center of an agreement. Rochester supplied land, labor, water, technical skill, and civic stability. Kodak supplied wages, institutions, and the expectation that the gates would continue opening each morning. War contracts, color film, and the post-war family market would enlarge both sides of that agreement. By 1957, nearly 1 in 3 Monroe County factory workers carried a Kodak paycheck. On bonus day, in March 1986, Eastman Kodak paid $239 million to 85,000 employees across the United States. Of that money, $158 million went to roughly 55,000 people around Rochester. Car dealers and retailers had circled the dates. The payments were not equal, but they arrived across the region at once, ready to become vacations, cars, and household purchases. Bonus Day was not a civic holiday. It behaved like one. Its source lay in miles of coated film. Kodachrome arrived in 1935 as 16mm color movie film, turning 3 light-sensitive layers into transparencies that could throw a birthday cake or a summer lake onto a living room wall. War gave Rochester a different customer. Kodak manufactured the K-24 aerial camera, more than 9,000 of them, for reconnaissance aircraft during the Second World War. Then peace carried photography back to kitchens, schoolyards, vacation cabins, 8mm cameras, metal film cans, and projectors clicking in darkened rooms. By 1957, Kodak employed about 34,000 people in the Rochester area, nearly 1 of every 3 factory workers in Monroe County. 21,000 entered Kodak Park alone, a 900-acre compound of coating buildings, chemical works, laboratories, power equipment, pipes, and railroad tracks. On State Street, Camera Works made cameras and projectors beside the 19-story office tower. At Hawkeye, workers built lenses, filters, and optical instruments. The family snapshot rested on a landscape of brick walls, silver compounds, precision glass, steam, and shift whistles. Kodak did not own the whole industrial city. Bausch and Lomb ground lenses and built microscopes. Graflex made cameras. Haloid, later renamed Xerox, developed copying machines. Smaller shops supplied tools and components. Kodak was the largest wheel in a cluster of optical, chemical, and mechanical trades, not the only wheel. That distinction mattered. Rochester had an industrial ecosystem, even as one company supplied much of its weather. The municipal map had already begun to mismeasure Kodak City. Rochester's population reached 332,488 in 1950, enough people to fill every block of the old city with children, boarders, factory hands, shopkeepers, and retirees. By 1960, the count had fallen to 308, 611. Kodak employment, however, kept climbing. Beginning in 1967, Camera Works moved from State Street to a 600-acre site in the town of Gates. The company had not yet retreated. Part of its payroll had simply crossed the city line. Black families were arriving as well, many from the South during the great post-war migration. Rochester offered factories with clean floors and steady wages, but access to those floors was not distributed like a public street. Housing barriers concentrated black residents inside the city, even when a household could afford more space elsewhere. A New York State report, issued in 1959, described Rochester's barriers to black homebuyers as the most rigid among upstate cities. Employment produced another pair of numbers. A contemporary report in 1967 put black residents at about 13% of Rochester's population, while black employees made up only 3.4% of Kodak's workforce. The difference could be read in pay envelopes, mortgage applications, and the addresses printed on personnel files. After the uprising of July 1964, black ministers and organizers formed FIGHT under the leadership of Franklin Florence. The organization demanded that Kodak train and hire people shut out of the city's better-paid industrial jobs. Kodak pointed to programs already in place and refused to surrender control over recruitment. An agreement reached late in 1966 came apart because the two sides did not agree on what Kodak had actually promised. In April 1967, the dispute reached Kodak's annual shareholders' meeting, where clergy and protesters made employment policy part of the company's public business. A compromise followed in June. Kodak agreed to send interviewers into selected inner-city locations operating under FIGHT's auspices, and to accept an advisor on conditions in Black Rochester. FIGHT gained a route into the hiring office. Kodak retained the authority to decide whom and how many it would hire. The door moved closer to the neighborhood. The hinges remained at Kodak. Local Kodak employment finally peaked in 1982 at 60,400 people. The city population had already been falling for 32 years. Those facts were not opposites. They described a company whose plants, workers, homes, and spending had spread across municipal boundaries, while access to its best protections remained uneven. 4 years later, Bonus Day sent $158 million through the region in a single release. The checks entered car lots and stores from thousands of households. Other households lived only a few streets away from Kodak buildings without holding a Kodak badge. 7 years before that employment peak, a young electrical engineer named Stephen Sasson had assembled an experimental camera inside Kodak. It used a solid-state sensor, stored a black and white image on magnetic tape, and consumed no film. The device was still a laboratory object, while Kodak's payroll continued to rise. Its coating lines continued to run, and Bonus Day still lay ahead. The payroll was still growing when a young Kodak engineer built a camera that needed no roll of film at all. In December 1975, Stephen Sasson set an 8-pound machine on a laboratory table at Kodak. A lens removed from a Super 8 movie camera faced a technician named Joy Marshall. Behind it sat 6 circuit boards, an analog-to-digital converter, a Fairchild image sensor, 16 nickel-cadmium batteries, and a portable cassette recorder bolted into an open metal frame. Sasson pressed the switch. The exposure lasted about 1/20th of a second. The machine then spent 23 seconds writing the picture onto magnetic tape. No executive committee had ordered a replacement for film. In 1974, Sasson's supervisor, Gareth Lloyd, had given the young engineer a narrow assignment: investigate whether a new charge-coupled device could produce a usable image. The sensor contained 100 rows of 100 light-sensitive points. Sasson decided to build the rest of the system around it, drawing parts from laboratory shelves and used equipment bins. It was a research job, small enough to fit around a table, not a corporate plan to dismantle Kodak Park. The cassette had to be removed and placed in a separate playback unit before anything appeared on a television monitor. Marshall's first portrait was a square of 10,000 black and white pixels. Dark and light shapes survived, but the middle tones of her face dissolved into electronic static. Sasson found an error in the way the recorded bits were being retrieved, corrected the circuit, and tried again. Her head and shoulders emerged. The image was crude, but no silver halide. Crystal had been exposed. No film had crossed a coating line, and no developing tank was waiting. Kodak received a patent for the electronic still camera in December 1978. A patent, however, was not a store shelf. A $1 brownie had worked the moment its shutter clicked. Sasson's machine required a separate playback cabinet, a television, magnetic tape, and nearly half a minute of waiting. Film already offered color, fine detail, inexpensive cameras, established laboratories, and prints that could be held without owning a computer. The digital camera had arrived before the household machinery needed to receive it. The familiar version of the story says that Kodak placed the prototype in a cupboard and forgot what it had seen. The company's own product record does not support that version. Kodak continued developing sensors and electronic imaging. In 1987, it entered the electronic still video market with products for recording, storing, transmitting, and printing images. In 1990, it announced Photo CD, which placed digitized photographs on a compact disc for display on a television. The following year, its professional digital camera system joined a Nikon camera body to a Kodak sensor containing 1.3 million pixels. By 1993, Kodak had spent roughly $5 billion on digital imaging research, far too much for a technology supposedly left inside a cupboard. The company could see the new road. Its difficulty was that the road bypassed most of the buildings it already owned. Film made money through repetition. A customer bought the camera once, then purchased roll after roll. Each exposure required a strip of plastic, gelatin, light-sensitive compounds, a paper print, processing chemicals, packaging, transport, and paid labor. A family taking its 1,000th photograph still pulled another small load of material through Kodak's factories. With digital photography, the 1,000th exposure required almost nothing that Rochester could coat, cut, box, or develop. The camera could be sold. The picture left no order for film behind it. Pressure reached that system before digital cameras were ready for most households. Fujifilm entered the American market with lower prices and lower production costs. In 1981, the Japanese company outbid Kodak for the right to become the official film sponsor of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. During the Games, spectators saw Fuji's green boxes attached to an event held in Kodak's largest national market. The loss did not destroy Kodak, but it weakened an old assumption. An American family asking for film would not necessarily ask for the yellow box. Kodak, therefore, had to finance two businesses moving in opposite directions. Film still produced the cash, laboratory work, and manufacturing volume needed to fund electronic research, yet a successful digital product reduced the future demand for the very materials paying for that research. Kodak repeatedly tried to build bridges between the systems. Digital files printed on Kodak paper, film images transferred to compact discs, electronic cameras sold to professionals, while consumer film remained on store racks. Each bridge preserved some chemical work. A fully digital photograph needed none of it. The contradiction was visible in brick and payroll. In 1987, Kodak entered electronic still video and began constructing a new Rochester plant for coating professional color film. Engineers worked on reusable electronic images, while steel and concrete were being arranged around another generation of consumable material. Neither investment was irrational by itself. Together, they placed the company on both sides of the same disappearing order. The reductions began while film still filled drugstore counters. In February 1986, Kodak announced plans to eliminate nearly 13,000 positions worldwide, including about 1,200 at its Rochester headquarters. 1 month later, retailers and car dealers still circled bonus day. The consumer had not yet abandoned the film camera. The company's payroll had already started to leave. Kodak could sell the new camera, but every digital picture removed the film, paper, chemicals, and processing that had paid Rochester. In November 1997, Eastman Kodak announced that 10,000 jobs would be removed from its worldwide payroll. Rochester had already absorbed a quieter subtraction. The company's local workforce, 60,400 at its peak in 1982, had fallen to roughly 34,000 by the end of 1996. Nearly every second badge represented by the peak was already gone before the next reduction was printed. By December, Kodak enlarged the worldwide plan again to 16,600 positions. There was no single closing whistle. One department stopped hiring. Another offered retirement. A laboratory merged with the laboratory in the next building. Equipment work went to an outside supplier, a gate that had admitted. 3 shifts began admitting 2. Each reduction could be described as temporary discipline, a response to one difficult quarter or one aggressive competitor. Together, they changed the amount of money. Crossing Rochester's lunch counters, mortgage desks, repair shops, and automobile lots, 3 pressures were operating, and they did not arrive together. Fujifilm had challenged Kodak's prices and market share before most households owned a digital camera. Corporate restructuring moved production, sold divisions, and outsourced work that might once have remained behind Kodak fences. Then, digital photography removed the recurring purchase itself. The early job losses cannot all be charged to the electronic image. The electronic image made the later losses harder to stop. Kodak did sell digital cameras. For a time, it sold many of them. But a color film cartridge passed through a market with few serious producers and returned the customer for processing and prints. A digital camera entered an electronics aisle crowded with Canon, Sony, Nikon, Samsung, and rapidly changing components. According to a later business study, Kodak lost about $60 on every digital camera it sold in 2001. A box could leave the store carrying Kodak's name while taking $60 with it. Market share no longer guaranteed the old kind of profit. Rochester also carried the physical weight of the previous system. In the early 1990s, Kodak Park contained about 200 manufacturing buildings and supported 15,000 workers inside its boundaries. Nearly 30 miles of private roads connected coating rooms, chemical plants, warehouses, laboratories, and loading docks. The site generated power and steam, moved rail cars, treated water and sewage, maintained a fire department, and supported pension and retiree obligations accumulated during larger payrolls. A film order could disappear in a season. A boiler, sewer, or pension did not shrink with it. By the middle of the next decade, Kodak was removing the rooms that no longer had work. During the first year of a $200 million plan to reduce Kodak Park's footprint, 19 buildings and sheds were demolished. Other structures were emptied, sold, or prepared for demolition. About 2.5 million square feet, floors where machines had stood, windows that had been washed, roofs that had held Rochester snow, was cleared or marked to go. The plan called for shrinking the complex by roughly 1/3. On November 11, 2008, the name Kodak Park disappeared from the entrance, and Eastman Business Park took its place. The new name advertised factory space to outside tenants. It also acknowledged a change already visible beyond the sign. The grounds could no longer depend upon one company to fill them. Kodak City was being converted into industrial real estate 4 years before a bankruptcy court described the company's condition. By the end of 2011, only 5,129 Kodak employees remained in the Rochester area. For every dozen local badges at the 1982 peak, roughly one was left. On January 19, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 protection. The petition listed about $5.1 billion in assets against $6.75 billion in liabilities. Warehouses, patents, machines, trademarks, debts, contracts, and promises that had accumulated under one corporate roof were now entries to be valued and separated. The separation was physical as well as legal. Kodak agreed to sell roughly 1,100 digital imaging patents for about $525 million. Consumer film, photo kiosks, and document scanning operations passed into a new company, Kodak Alaris, through a settlement with the United Kingdom Pension Plan. Red Rochester purchased the park's power plant, water system, and wastewater treatment facilities. The company that emerged in 2013 was smaller and concentrated on commercial printing, packaging, and imaging for businesses. The camera, the processing counter, and the utility pipe no longer belonged to the same structure. Kodak had not caused every difficulty in Rochester. The city's population had begun declining, while Kodak employment was still rising, and its housing and racial divisions were older than the digital sensor. Other manufacturers also contracted or moved work. What Kodak's retreat removed was a thick layer of well-paid production jobs that had placed thousands of households between those older divisions and an empty paycheck. By 2011, more than 55,000 local positions had vanished from the peak, one retirement offer, and locked gate at a time. The court could assign a price to a patent, transfer a processing business, and place a power plant under new ownership. It could not carry away 4 miles of roads, buried pipes, treatment works, rail spurs, brick foundations, or the ground beneath them. After the bankruptcy court separated patents, pensions, utilities, and product lines, Rochester was left with something harder to divide: the park itself. The sign at the entrance now says Eastman Business Park. Behind it, the old Kodak Park still occupies 1,200 acres between Rochester and the town of Greece. Railroad tracks enter the property. Pipes cross between long brick buildings. Laboratories, warehouses, coating rooms, water lines, steam lines, and electrical equipment remain where one company once arranged them around the manufacture of film. The machinery of a private city is still there. It simply has more than one name on the doors. By 2022, the park contained 117 companies from several countries. Kodak estimated that about 5,500 people worked inside its boundaries, but only 1,100 of them worked for Kodak. At the local employment peak, one company had carried 60,400 names on its Rochester payroll. Now thousands of workers still passed through the gates, but their badges led to separate employers, separate benefit plans, and separate decisions made in separate offices. The difference can be heard in what the buildings make. Some rooms support biomaterials and chemical manufacturing. Others handle energy storage, electronic components, hydrogen fuel cell materials, food products, or precision coating. Film had required liquid chemistry to be spread evenly across miles of flexible material, without dust, bubbles, or changes in thickness. That expertise did not become useless when family pictures moved onto screens. The same broad coating machines and controlled rooms could be used for battery components, specialty films, and materials that George Eastman never had a reason to name. The park is therefore not an abandoned factory, though parts of it have been demolished and others no longer perform their original work. Its shared infrastructure remains unusually large. Tenants can obtain industrial water, steam, chilled water, electricity, wastewater treatment, laboratories, fire protection, rail service, and loading space, without building a private utility system first. Kodak once assembled those services because film demanded them all at once. The smaller companies arrived because the expensive parts were already in the ground. Kodak arrived at the same present by becoming smaller without disappearing. In 2025, the company reported $1.069 billion in revenue. Most of it came not from yellow boxes at drugstore counters, but from commercial printing systems, printing plates, inks, specialty chemicals, and advanced materials. Motion picture film still comes from Kodak coating operations. Film can still leave Rochester for sets, where directors have chosen grain, emulsion, and laboratory processing over an electronic sensor, but the surviving name can distort the scale. At the end of 2024, Kodak employed approximately 3,000 people across 29 countries. That entire worldwide workforce amounted to fewer than one employee for every 15 Kodak had employed around Rochester alone in 1982. The company still had laboratories, products, customers, and revenue. It no longer had enough paychecks to set the rhythm of automobile sales, house purchases, school enrollments, and bonus day across Monroe County. The bankruptcy court could divide product lines, patents, utilities, and property. It could not make the chemistry beneath the property disappear. Under the environmental settlement approved after bankruptcy, Kodak funded a $49 million trust for investigation, cleanup, and monitoring at Eastman Business Park and along the adjacent Genesee. The obligation survived in wells, sediment samples, engineering drawings, and accounts reserved for work that would continue after consumer film had nearly vanished. The material tying that work to the old product was silver. Inside photographic emulsion, grains of silver halide were suspended in gelatin. Light struck those microscopic crystals and left a latent image, an arrangement too faint to see until the developer converted the exposed grains into visible silver or allowed color, dyes to form around them. A birthday candle, a soldier, a vacation cabin, and a child holding a brownie all began as changes inside those crystals. Kodak manufactured them by the mile. Historic releases from that manufacturing also carried silver through the industrial system and into localized areas of river sediment and wetland soil. New York investigators sampled water, mud, floodplain soil, fish, mussels, and suspended sediment along the lower Genesee. They studied ice movement and the places where the riverbed could scour during high water. The Department of Environmental Conservation described the potential risk as relatively low and localized. Even so, it identified silver as the principal site-related contaminant of concern in the sediment and adjoining wetlands. The selected remedy concentrated on specific pockets rather than the entire river. Its design called for approximately 25,000 cubic yards of sediment to be dredged from 2 river areas covering 4.1 acres and 2 wetland areas covering another 2 acres. The material was taken away for off-site disposal. Clean fill restored the wetland grades. Over the dredged riverbed, workers placed engineered cap material to isolate remaining contamination, resist erosion, and provide a new habitat surface. That work ran from April through December of 2021. Shorelines and wetlands disturbed by excavation were restored, but completion did not end the obligation. The remedy included continuing inspection, maintenance, monitoring, and reporting. A cap in a moving river is not a sealed drawer. Water levels rise, ice passes, sediment shifts. Someone must return, measure the surface, and confirm that the layers remain where the drawings say they should be. The river had supplied Rochester's first industrial power, turning millstones before cameras or film existed. Later, it ran beside the treatment works of the company that organized much of the city around light-sensitive chemistry. Today, the pictures no longer travel home to Rochester in their cameras. The single payroll has become many. Kodak remains, smaller than the industrial landscape built around it, while trains and pipes continue serving companies behind the renamed gate. North of the park, the water passes the restored wetlands and the capped sections near King's Landing. The Genesee keeps moving north toward Lake Ontario, over a riverbed rebuilt in layers above the silver.